Well, hello there. Welcome back to my channel. This is Carol King, and we're going to do another 4 textures today. And again, I'm using the Watercolor 100% cotton. And let me get that back in position for you. I'm going to start with dry brush. I hope you enjoyed the last ones. We're doing 20 total series of different textures that you can do with watercolors that you can use to sort of spruce up your paintings. And some of these you're going to know, and some of them maybe you haven't heard of, so hopefully we'll all learn something along the way. I'm certainly having a lot of fun playing. So we're going to start with dry brush. And some people use this for just the ground. Some people use it for trees. Some people use it for basically, you can use it for anything you want. If I wanted a hillside, I wanted to have a little texture on it, this is dry brush. I don't have a lot on it. I'm using the side of the brush, which you don't have to. Once it's dry enough, you can use the tip too. And then if you came back with some color, again, you tap it and make sure it's dry. And then you could add a little blue to that. You could add another color, tap it. There's not much on that one. Let's see. Let's do some green. A little too dry. It's supposed to be dry, but not quite that dry. So you can see that it's leaving a lot of white because there's just not that much paint on the brush. So it leaves quite a bit of white, and it adds texture. It looks like you worked hard to create texture when you actually didn't, which is kind of nice. If you can do it easier, and it looks looser too, and everybody likes loose watercolors. Well, I think most everybody likes loose watercolors. Shouldn't make a statement like that, I guess. So I'm going to dry that off, and let me see here. This is one of these synthetic brushes are great for creating a dry brush texture. Let's say you got a tree. You want to do a tree. And let's find ourselves a good gray here. And you can create some nice bark texture with a dry brush technique. Just by going, it's a little too dry again. I'm trying not to have it too wet and mess it up and getting it too dry. It almost becomes if it's too dry, it almost becomes like you're using a colored pencil. So, which I suppose is all right if that's an effect that you want. Let's get a little more paint on this brush. Make it a little more visible for you. Look at that. Doesn't that look like tree bark? Just sort of rough looking. So it is wonderful for all kinds of different things. You can come in with a darker color. Add some shades, add some knots, or whatever you want to do. But this is dry brush. And then after it's dry, you could come back in and do a glaze over it to create shadows around the edge of the tree, so that, that's why it's actually better to do that first, to be honest with you. I prefer to do that first. I'll make a very basic tree where I've already got my shadows in there, and then I'll come back once it's dry and add my dry brush texture. But I'm going to go ahead and create my shadows so that when I do my dry brush, that's already done for me. And maybe a couple shadows over here, and maybe we have a branch coming out. A little dry brush going on there. I will let that dry for a minute and then come back over it See, you've created your effects already with the underpainting to make it look circular, because you've got dark on one side, just a little bit of dark on the other side. And so it already's got that round feeling to it. And you just want to add some texture and make it look like a tree, right? Maybe there's a big shadow right here where one of the roots is coming up, like that. Maybe there's a knot right there. So we'll let that dry for just a moment and then come back and dry brush over it, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Okay, so I want to show you, as I'm mixing my colors over here, I'm not adding a lot of water. I've got some straight color. If I were to get my brush very wet, I'm not going to be able to do much dry brushing. Now you can dip it into the wet stuff and then wipe it off, but you're just kind of wasting a lot of paint if you do that. So I prefer to sort of mix it in a dry way over here and then bring it on. I don't know if this is quite dry enough, but we're going to try. A little more darkened colors. You can see that that gives the impression of bark, and you really didn't have to work too hard at it. So it's wonderful for just getting a slightly looser effect on your watercolors. So that is dry brush. So here's an example of how I used it in a painting. So I've got this little horse that I did, right? And when I wanted to do the shadows right in here, that's dry brush. This is dry brush right down here. This is dry brush. These shadows right in here are dry brush. You can see that I did a lot of this, some of it in wet. Let's see if I can zoom this out so you can see the whole thing. But there was a lot of wet, but there was also quite a bit of dry brushing to just give a little texture to the actual horse. Helps you with another technique to add a little splash of interest to your paintings. And we're going to do scratching. We'll do grass and trees again. You know, I love doing nature and trees, but you can translate this into whatever you're using. When you look at it, you'll see it and you'll go, oh yeah, I could use that for, you know, this or that. I'm gonna move my paints in front of me. Okay, I'm sorry you can't see my palette, but I was trying to zoom in better on the actual, to have closer views for you on what we're painting this time. So let's start with, let's say that we want to do some grass, okay? So we have a little bit of green over here. And we're going to stretch out some ideas of grass right here. Okay. Now, you can take the end of one of your paintbrushes. This is a number, I don't know what this is. And you can scratch out some more detail to your grass. Not only does that bring the paint up, but it also creates texture down below, because when you scratch the paper, the paint runs into it. And when it runs in, it creates a little bit of shadow. So that's, you can create the idea of lots of different blades of grass without individually having to paint them with your paintbrush. And that's by sharpening the end of your, this is just my paintbrush. Then you can use scratching, as I was telling you, on tree trunks to get the texture of, let's say we've got a big old oak, and you know how textured they are, right? So I'm going to paint the oak trunk. again, I'm going to go ahead and add some shadow on the back. Some blue. And maybe a little lighter color over here. Okay, now I'm going to start scratching. So I want it to look like an oak. You can do this various different ways for different kinds of trees, but I'm going for the effect of oak, which is like a lot of linear up and down squiggly marks. And then every now and then you have to come in and connect them. Now you see how the water's running into that and creating all of those shadows that look like they are. Oops, that's a little too much brown. That's okay. It works. It'll continue to soak in. If you add a little color, it'll continue to soak into those shadows, so they will again darken back up. And you can come back later if you want and highlight some of these little spots. But the easiest way would be to combine the scratching with the dry brush, and then you could grab a little white and dry brush on one side maybe and make it look like it's highlighted by the air, or by the light. Air highlights, that would be interesting. So if I had my white, let's pretend that this is dry, but you can see how it's adding some white to it. If it was dry and I was dry brushing over it, you'd get a little extra texture on there. So let's say that it's you've got a cat or something that you're painting, okay? So you want to give the semblance of fur. Clarence was the cat that I used to have. He was orange and white, so we're going to make this guy orange and white. This is just, you want to give this just the idea that there's hair in here without huge amounts of effort. Just every here and there. In the dark areas, it'll lift if you catch it in the right time. In the light areas, it creates the shadows. So you've got instant fur texture. That's a little too dry over here, so it's not working as well. But because I'm picking up a little of the dark paint over here where it's picking it up, it's actually putting it down over here, which sort of works for me. Oh, that's picking up nicely. I like that. Looks a little more like a porcupine than a cat, but at any rate, you get the point that you can add texture in various ways with this scratching technique. If you wanted to scratch a little deeper, you can use a nib. And it will, well, if it was wet, let's get it a little wetter over here. You can draw pretty much anything. It'll be a little bit deeper and it'll sink in better because this is a pretty sharp tip, unlike the wooden tip on my brush. So you're just creating a hollow for the paint to run into. That might be dry enough that I could do what I was telling you about the texture with the white. So now we combined a little bit of our dry brush with the scratching to create extra texture on this tree. That's kind of cool. Okay, let's move on to masking and splattering. If you've watched a lot of training videos online, you'll know that we like to splatter. And that's something that I haven't done very much in the past in my videos, but I'm learning. I'm always learning. So let's see. This side I already splattered with masking, and the reason I did that is it has to dry before it's any good. So I used drawing gum because I could stick a toothbrush in that and then splatter. A toothbrush will make very fine splatter. If you put it on the end of your brush, like I'm going to show you in a minute, it won't be so fine. So it just depends on the effect that you want, whether you use a toothbrush or something else. We're going to cover these guys right here so that we can splatter freely without messing up all our other work. Okay. So I've got a little bit of sand maybe down here on a beach or something. And I want it to look like it's got a little texture, right? So a great way to do that is smaller brush is best depending on the size of the splatter that you want. So here's a little, I think it's a 00. Because I'm doing a small area, I'm not looking for a large splatter, okay? So I'm going to get my paintbrush fairly wet here. And I'm just going to tap my finger. You can also tap another brush. And that's with the bottom wet. You see how it gave it some texture? Come in with another color. Just splatter on top. Maybe another color. And there you've got this sort of dirt or sand or whatever it is that you're trying to create. But it's a wonderful texture. Now that was on a wet. Because I had already just painted it brown. These spots are going on a wet surface, which is different, which is why up here we're going to do dry. And I'm using a small brush just because I don't have that much space to work with. So we're going to splatter dry up here. And add another color because it's always nice when they start mixing. You can do this on top of other colors that have dried too. You know, if you have a nice scene that's out in the country or something and you're like, oh, that would look really good with flowers. So you can splatter some flowers on. Just, if I were doing that, I would probably tear some pieces of paper towel to go above and below the area where I'm wanting to splatter a strip of flowers, right? That way I'm not getting it everywhere. I'm just putting the flowers, you know, maybe there's a little bunch of flowers growing in the middle, but they're not everywhere. And you don't want to splatter your sky either. So a little bit of paper towel is wonderful. So there's splatter in several colors. If you do it in a larger brush, I'll just show you. Let's say if you're doing a bigger painting and you needed to splatter with a larger brush, you're going to get bigger dots with a larger brush. And also depends on how much you load it. You can practice. Just practice on the side somewhere, and I always do that before I put it on my painting, particularly if it's something I've been working on for a while. I will splatter on the side on a piece of paper and make sure that I got the feel for how much splatter I want before I start putting that stuff down, because it doesn't come back up. So there is a paint splatter. And now I'm going to move this over and show you over here where I pre-splattered it with a sponge. And I'm going to try this new color I just bought, Quinacridone, Daniel Smith Quinacridone Purple. And this is going to have to dry a little bit before I can show you what it looks like with the underneath, the color underneath, obviously, because it is, I have to lift it up because it was masking, so I have to lift up what I did with the masking. We're going to let that dry for a little bit so that I can lift my masking and let you see. If you pre-splatter an area, this can also be done in the middle of the painting. You could already have 2 layers down and you're thinking, okay, I like that color, but I want to put some darks on top of this layer, but I'd like to leave some of the previous color underneath. So you can splatter on top of that field of grass or whatever it is, or ground, splatter on top of it with a little toothbrush. And all I did with that was I stuck it in my drawing gum, and I just did this. Okay, so you could splatter on top of your layer of paint. When it dries, when the drawing gum dries, you go ahead and paint another layer on. And then once that's completely dry, I like to wait several hours, sometimes even overnight if it's a very wet painting, because if you try to wipe up drawing gum from a wet surface, you're going to make a mess. It will tear your paper really bad. So wait until it's completely dry, and then come back and do the lift it up, and you'll have some layered splatter, which will look really cool. Now, most of you have probably seen salt. While that dries, we're going to move on to salt. Let's see here. I got 3 kinds of salt that I use. So we're going to try all 3 of them. Let's say that this is a dark sky that you want to create some snow effects on. I prefer to splatter for snow, I'll be honest with you. I just like the look of snow splatter. But let's assume, for the sake of exercise, that you want the bigger flakes, or maybe stars. So this little corner over here, we are going to do a dark sky. I'm going to let it dry a little bit, because otherwise you will get, and I'll give you a sample down here, if you don't let it dry a little bit, it will literally suck up all of the surrounding area, and you wind up with a really, really large lifting. It lifts a lot. So I like to wait for that to dry just a little bit. I'm going to tilt it. Get my paint tray out of the way. I like to tilt that because it's starting to ride. It's not going to dry evenly. So I'm going to tip that down, let that moisture flow down just a bit. Okay, I'm going to let that dry for just a minute while I go over here and do something different. So over here, let's assume we have a dark area. Not dark, but we want to create a larger impact mark, okay? We're trying to make a larger mark. So that's why I made that considerably darker. Down here, we're going to do kosher salt, which is a little bit thicker. Not considerably thicker, but a little bit thicker than the regular salt. And so you do lift slightly different way. Oh, let's try that new orange. This new orange I just got is, let's see, transparent pyrrole, I think is how I pronounced it. Pyrrole maybe. That mixes the red. And that is actually, it went on thick enough that I think I'm going to go ahead and put that down now. And that is, this is kosher salt, which is considerably larger than table salt, which is what I used on the first one. Table salt is the first one. And over up here, before it gets very dry at all, we're going to use ice cream salt. These are big chunks. Big crystals. Now this has to dry overnight. I may not be able to let it dry overnight because I'm trying to upload this today, but I will try to move this process along as much as I can and hope that we can create what we wanted. You can see that it's starting to pull already. On this one over here, now it's dry enough. I think I want to sprinkle some stars in the sky. Okay, if you do too many, it'll be in piles like it was right here. I add a little moisture by spritzing with salt just because it was drying too fast. Let's see if I can add a little more paint in the corner and move one of those over so you can see better what it does when it's good and wet. Put that right there. This can look like little rocks. It'll create kind of a little rocky area. So it can really help you with texture. I'm just going to put a little bit. This is what you have to do if you let it dry too. I was talking so much and painting the bottom layer that I wound up allowing the top layer to dry too much. So now I'm going to let this sit and dry. This is still not dry enough for me to come take that off, so we will be back in just a little bit. Well, I let it dry for a couple hours, and let's see what happened. If you take a dry paper towel, it's a great way to remove the salt. I'm going to put something under it to kind of capture that salt too. So it can be a little messy. So let's just... I love the look of those rocks. If we could leave that on there, that would be neat, because that salt makes a pretty neat looking little rock, like on a dull dry bed or something, dry creek bed. That almost looks like a little underwater bush, doesn't it? The kosher salt didn't quite do as much. I think it's because the red was thicker. I think if you watered down the red a little bit more than I did, you'd be better off. But this definitely looks like a bunch of stones. I love that effect. And this looks pretty cool, but it just didn't lift as much. Of course, red is pretty staining, but I think it was just too thick. Remember I told you that was a bit thick as I put it down. It probably should have watered it down some to allow the salt to be able to absorb some more. And then here was the sprinkle on the very wet and somewhat dry with just regular table salt. So this is table salt, kosher salt, and ice cream salt. I love the effect of the ice cream salt. That was awesome. Clean this up and we'll move over to our splattering and see how that turned out. Okay. Now I'm going to use the same paper towel and I'm going to wipe off the little marks that I made, or the splattering that I made with the toothbrush. And they were too small because you can't see them very well. So clearly I did not make big enough marks. These are big right here, but the splatter was not enough on that. So maybe we'll have to play with a second one and show you another time how it can look different, because I don't like the way that turned out at all. You just can't hardly tell. But if you do, you know, some pre-splattering, and then you want to come back and add on top of it with regular splatter, that actually can look pretty cool as well. So you've got your whites that you splattered, and then you can come and splatter another color on top of it. So you've got white, and then you've got your basic color, and then you've got third, fourth, or fifth colors that you're going to splatter on top. It sort of adds a little bit more depth. particularly up here around that white. And these are textures that you can do. Now that the tree is completely dry, you can see quite clearly the texture. And I like the way that turned out. That is really obvious texture. And of course, what I tried to do earlier that didn't work because it wasn't dry enough, you can dry brush on top of this and add extra texture. Like that. Like maybe the light's hitting it in those spots or something. Well, I do hope that this was helpful this week and that this gives you some ideas on how to add texture to your paintings. And hopefully you can try some of them out on one of your works this week. So as always, please like and subscribe. Liking the video will help others find it, and subscribing, of course, will let you know if I've got a new video coming up. So join me next week for the next 4 ways of adding texture to your watercolors. And as always, keep painting.